They said a man without land was a man without a name, and on that cold March morning, the town decided Elias Whitaker no longer deserved either one. The wind carried the smell of dry dust and melting frost across the prairie as the sheriff's wagon rolled to a slow stop in front of his gate, wheels grinding against gravel that hadn't seen rain in months. Folks gathered along the split-rail fence, boots planted in the hard Oklahoma clay, coats pulled tight against the last bite of winter, their eyes fixed on the old rancher like he was a broken tool finally being thrown away. Elias stood alone beside his weathered barn, shoulders bent from years of hauling feed and drawing water from a 40-foot well, his hat pulled low but his gaze steady, the same quiet look he wore every morning when he stepped outside before sunrise to check on a single aging mare that was all he had left. The sheriff climbed down from the wagon without hurry, smoothing the front of his coat as if this were just another piece of business, then reached into the bed and pulled out a rough plank of pine, the letters carved deep and dark enough to be read from 50 yards away. A hammer appeared in his hand, heavy and certain, and the sound of metal striking nail echoed across the empty pasture, sharp and final, once, twice, 3 times, each blow settling into the silence like a verdict no court had spoken. When the hammering stopped, the board hung crooked on the gate, swaying slightly in the wind, the words staring back at everyone gathered there, worth nothing. No one cheered. No one argued. They simply watched, arms folded, breath visible in the cool morning air, as if the sign explained everything they needed to believe about the man who had lived among them for nearly 30 years. Elias didn't step forward to tear it down, didn't raise his voice or plead his case, though every board on that ranch carried the marks of his hands, and every acre of dry grass had once answered to his care. Instead, he rested his palm lightly against the top rail of the gate, feeling the rough grain beneath his skin, and listened to the distant cry of a hawk circling above the open range, a sound that reminded him how wide the world still was, even when a town tried to make it small. The sheriff cleared his throat, reading from a folded paper in a flat, official tone, explaining that the land had been claimed to settle old debts, that the cattle were long gone, that the property would be listed for sale by the end of the week, his words drifting through the crowd like cold smoke, practical and final. A few men shifted their weight. A woman pulled her shawl tighter. But no one stepped forward to speak for the rancher. Not the blacksmith who once borrowed his wagon. Not the storekeeper who used to share coffee on winter mornings. Not even the preacher who had blessed the fields in better years. Elias Whitaker simply nodded once, slow and calm, as if he had been expecting this moment all along, then reached into the inside pocket of his worn coat and felt the small object he carried there every day. A faded feather wrapped in cloth, light as air but heavier than any deed or dollar the town could measure. He closed his fingers around it for a heartbeat, drawing a quiet breath through lungs that had tasted dust, smoke, and summer heat for decades, then released it again, letting the memory rest where it belonged. The sheriff turned away, satisfied the matter was finished, and the townsfolk began to drift back toward the road, boots crunching against gravel, voices low and certain, convinced they had just witnessed the end of a man's story. None of them noticed the way Elias lifted his eyes toward the far horizon, where the prairie stretched beyond sight, nor the faint tremor that rolled through the ground beneath his boots, so soft it might have been mistaken for the settling of earth after a long winter, a quiet movement that carried across miles of open land, growing steadier with every passing second. Elias Whitaker remained by the gate long after the wagon wheels faded into the distance, his hand still resting on the rough pine rail as the prairie wind pushed against his coat and carried the faint smell of thawing earth across the empty fields, a smell that always meant winter was finally losing its grip on the land. The sign creaked softly above him, swinging back and forth on the fresh nails, the words dark and certain, and he studied it the way a rancher studies the sky before a storm, not with anger, not with fear, but with the quiet patience of a man who had seen seasons come and go without asking his permission. He turned slowly toward the barn, boots pressing deep into the softening mud, and began his morning chores as if nothing had changed, because out on the prairie, work did not wait for pride or sorrow. The old mare lifted her head when he entered the stall, ears twitching at the sound of his footsteps, and he reached into a burlap sack to scoop out a measure of feed, the grain rattling into the tin pan with a steady, familiar rhythm that filled the silence. She nudged his shoulder gently, searching for the apple he sometimes saved for her, and he allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile before running his hand along her neck, feeling the warmth of her breath against his palm, a reminder that something in this world still trusted him without question. Outside, the sun climbed higher, pale and thin, casting long shadows across the pasture where cattle once grazed by the dozens, back when the fences were straight and the well bucket came up heavy with water every morning. Now the fields stretched wide and empty, dotted only with patches of stubborn grass pushing through the dry soil, and the wind moved across them with a lonely whistle that seemed to carry the voices of years long gone. Elias walked to the well, wrapped the rope around his hands, and lowered the bucket into the dark shaft, listening to the faint splash far below, then pulled it back up inch by inch, muscles straining in his arms the way they always had, though the strength came slower now, measured and careful. He poured the water into a wooden trough, watching the surface ripple and settle, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing in the cool air, his gaze drifting toward the distant line of hills where the land met the sky. That was where the memory always lived, just beyond reach, waiting like an old friend who never forgot his name. 15 years earlier, on a night when the wind howled across the prairie and snow fell so hard it erased the road completely, he had seen a small figure stumble through the darkness near that same horizon, barely more than a shadow against the storm. The child had been thin and shaking, wrapped in a torn blanket, eyes wide with fear, but burning with a quiet strength that did not belong to someone so young. He had opened his door without asking questions, guided her to the warmth of the stove, and placed a cup of hot broth into her trembling hands while the fire cracked softly behind them. She had not spoken much, only watched him with a look of deep attention, as if memorizing every line of his face. And when the storm finally passed, and the morning sun broke through the clouds, she had left as quietly as she arrived, pressing a single feather into his hand before stepping back onto the open prairie. He had kept that feather ever since, tucked safely inside his coat, not as payment, not as proof, but as a promise that kindness did not disappear just because the world chose to forget it. A sudden gust of wind rattled the loose boards along the barn wall, pulling him back to the present, and he reached into his pocket once more, fingers brushing the soft edge of the feather, drawing strength from its simple presence. Far beyond the fence line, the land shimmered under the rising sun, and though the town believed his story had ended that morning, the prairie itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something still unseen to arrive. The afternoon settled over the ranch with a slow, heavy stillness, the kind that pressed against the ears until even the smallest sound felt important, and Elias Whitaker sensed it before he fully understood it, a faint uneasiness drifting through the warm spring air like dust carried on a distant breeze. He finished mending a loose hinge on the barn door, tightening the final bolt with steady hands, then stepped back to test the swing, listening to the metal creak and settle into place. It was honest work, simple and necessary, the kind of task that kept a man grounded when the world around him shifted in ways he could not control. The sun hung high above the prairie now, casting bright light across the rolling acres, turning every patch of grass into a pale gold shimmer that stretched all the way to the far horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called out, its song clear and lonely, echoing across the open land where cattle once moved in slow, steady lines from fence to fence. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve and walked toward the porch, each step measured and calm, his boots leaving shallow prints in the soft dirt that would fade by morning. He lowered himself into the old wooden chair beside the door, the boards groaning gently beneath his weight, and rested his hands on his knees, letting the quiet surround him. The sign on the gate was still visible from where he sat, swaying slightly in the afternoon wind, its shadow stretching long across the ground like a reminder that the town had spoken and believed the matter finished. He studied it without bitterness, only a tired acceptance that life on the frontier could turn harsh without warning, just as a clear sky could suddenly fill with dark clouds rolling in from the west. A memory stirred again, stronger this time, pulling him back to that night so many years ago when the storm had swallowed the world beyond his windows. He remembered the way the snow piled high against the door, the wind rattling the shutters like restless hands, and the sudden knock that broke through the noise, soft but desperate. When he opened the door, the cold rushed in first, sharp and biting, followed by the small figure of the child standing alone in the swirling white darkness, her hair dusted with frost, and her eyes searching his face as if she had reached the last safe place left on earth. He had wrapped her in a wool blanket and set another log on the fire, watching the flames rise and fill the cabin with steady warmth, while she sat quietly near the hearth, holding the steaming cup he placed in her hands. There had been a calm strength in her silence, a dignity that did not belong to fear, and he remembered thinking that even the fiercest winter could not break a spirit like that. Outside, the wind howled and pressed against the walls, but inside the small room, the fire burned bright, and for a few hours the storm lost its power. The next morning, when the sky cleared and the sun shone over fresh drifts of snow, she stood at the doorway ready to leave, her posture straight and certain, as if she carried a purpose beyond the horizon. She had reached into her coat and pulled out a single feather, placing it gently into his palm with a nod that spoke louder than any words. He had watched her walk away across the open field until her figure became a dark speck against the bright snow, and something in his heart told him that their paths would cross again, though he never knew when or how. The creak of the porch boards beneath him brought him back to the present, and Elias lifted his head slowly, his eyes narrowing as he listened more carefully to the land around him. At first there was nothing unusual, only the steady whisper of wind moving through dry grass and the distant call of birds circling high above. Then, almost too faint to notice, a low vibration traveled through the ground beneath his boots, subtle but persistent, like the gentle rumble of faraway thunder rolling across the plains. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hand against the wooden floor of the porch, feeling the tremor grow stronger with each passing second, and his gaze shifted toward the wide horizon where the sky met the earth in a thin blue line. A narrow cloud of dust had begun to rise there, barely visible at first, twisting slowly upward into the bright afternoon light, and though no sound had yet reached his ears, the movement carried a quiet promise that the long silence surrounding his ranch was about to change in a way the town had never imagined. The dust on the horizon continued to rise, slow at first, then climbing higher into the bright afternoon sky until it formed a pale ribbon stretching across the open prairie, and Elias Whitaker remained seated on the porch, his back straight, his eyes fixed on that distant movement the way a seasoned rancher studies the weather rolling in from miles away. The vibration beneath the floorboards grew steadier now, not strong enough to shake the house, but firm enough to travel through the soles of his boots and settle deep in his bones, a rhythm carried by hooves striking dry earth somewhere beyond the hills. He did not rush inside. He did not reach for a rifle. Instead, he rested both hands on the worn arms of the chair and listened, breathing slowly, letting the land speak before he made any judgment. The old mare in the barn shifted uneasily, her hooves scraping softly against the wooden stall, and a low snort drifted through the open doorway, as animals often sense change long before people did. The wind picked up, sweeping across the empty pasture and rattling the loose boards along the fence line, carrying with it the faint scent of sun-baked dirt and distant sagebrush, a smell that always came ahead of travelers riding hard across the plains. Elias rose from the chair with careful strength, joints stiff but steady, and stepped down onto the porch steps, shading his eyes with one hand as he looked farther into the distance. The thin ribbon of dust had grown wider now, darker at its base, rolling forward like a slow tide pushing toward shore, and though the sound had not yet reached the ranch clearly, the earth continued to hum beneath him with quiet determination. He walked toward the gate, boots crunching over gravel that glinted in the afternoon light, and stopped a few feet short of the sign that still swayed there, the words harsh and certain against the soft blue sky. For a long moment, he studied those letters again, not with resentment, but with the calm understanding of a man who knew that judgment often arrived too quickly and truth took its time. He reached up and steadied the sign with one hand, stopping its restless swing, then released it gently, allowing the wood to settle back into place as the wind moved on. Across the valley, the dust cloud thickened, rising higher until it blurred the line between earth and sky, and at last the distant sound began to form, faint but unmistakable. A steady drumming carried across miles of open land, growing clearer with every passing heartbeat. Far beyond the ranch, in the direction of the town, a church bell suddenly rang once, sharp and uncertain, then again, echoing through the quiet streets where shopkeepers paused in their doorways and mothers gathered children close to their sides. Men stepped out onto wooden sidewalks, turning their heads toward the same horizon Elias watched, their faces tight with concern, because in a place where news traveled slowly, the sound of many horses moving together always meant change, and change rarely came without consequence. Back at the ranch, Elias remained still, his posture calm, his breathing steady, the afternoon sun warming his shoulders as he stood alone before the open gate. He slipped one hand into his coat pocket and felt the familiar shape of the feather resting there, soft and light against his fingers, and a memory flickered across his mind like sunlight through moving clouds, the image of a young girl standing in the doorway years ago, her dark eyes filled with quiet determination, her small hand placing that simple token into his palm. He closed his fingers gently around it now, not in fear, not in hope, but in recognition, as if some long-awaited moment had finally begun to unfold. The sound of hooves grew stronger, rolling across the prairie in a steady rhythm that could no longer be mistaken for thunder, and the dust cloud advanced with slow certainty, drawing closer to the lonely ranch where a single man stood waiting beneath the wide American sky, silent and unshaken, while the land itself seemed to hold its breath for what would come next. The sound of hooves rolled across the prairie now with steady weight, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, but clear and deliberate, like the slow beating of a drum carried on the warm spring wind, and Elias Whitaker stood at the gate with his shoulders squared, watching the wide horizon as the ribbon of dust thickened into a moving wall that stretched farther than any cattle drive he had seen in all his years on the frontier. The late afternoon sun dipped slightly toward the west, casting long golden light across the fields and turning the drifting dust into a glowing haze that shimmered above the earth, and in that light the shapes within the cloud began to form, dark silhouettes rising and falling in rhythm, horse and rider moving as one across the open land. He remained still, boots planted firm in the soil that had fed him, tested him, and nearly taken everything from him, his breathing slow and even, his eyes steady with the quiet patience of a man who understood that some moments in life arrived only once and deserved to be met without fear. Behind him, the loose boards along the fence rattled softly as the wind shifted direction, and the old sign hanging on the gate knocked gently against the wood, the sound hollow and uncertain now, as if even those harsh letters sensed their authority beginning to fade. Far down the road toward town, a line of wagons had gathered near the general store, men standing beside them with hats pulled low, their attention fixed on the same growing cloud, their voices hushed, because everyone in the valley could feel the weight of what was coming even before they understood its meaning. The church bell rang again, slower this time, its tone deep and uneasy, echoing across the wooden storefronts and empty streets where dust swirled between hitching posts and porch steps, and children were quietly guided indoors while mothers watched from behind lace curtains. Back at the ranch, the vibration beneath Elias's feet grew stronger, traveling through the ground like a pulse, steady and unwavering, until even the boards of the porch trembled faintly with each passing second. He slipped his hand into his coat pocket once more and touched the feather resting there, its surface worn smooth from years of quiet remembrance. And as his fingers closed around it, a calm certainty settled over him, not excitement, not dread, but recognition, the feeling a man gets when a long-forgotten promise finally returns to stand before him. The shapes in the dust moved closer now, spreading across the width of the valley in a broad line that stretched from one ridge to the other, horses stepping in measured rhythm, their motion disciplined and purposeful, not hurried, not reckless, but guided by a clear intention that carried across the miles. The first sound reached him then, the distinct cadence of iron horseshoes striking packed earth, firm and steady, echoing across the pasture with a strength that made the air itself seem to hum. He drew in a slow breath, filling his lungs with the warm scent of sunlit grass and distant sage, and lifted his chin slightly, his posture straightening with quiet dignity, the way a man stands when he knows the truth is finally about to be seen. The dust parted just enough for the leading riders to become visible, outlines sharpening against the fading light, figures seated tall in their saddles, guiding their horses forward with calm control, their presence commanding without a single word spoken. Elias did not step back. He did not reach for protection. He simply stood there at the open gate of the land that had been declared worthless only hours before, watching. As the riders closed the final distance, the thunder of hooves now filling the valley, rolling across the prairie like the steady arrival of something long promised, something patient, something just beginning to reveal itself beneath the wide American sky. The riders drew closer until the details of leather saddles and braided reins came into focus, each movement steady and controlled, each horse stepping with quiet discipline across the sunlit prairie, and Elias Whitaker remained standing at the gate, his shadow stretching long behind him across the dry grass as the late afternoon light softened into the warm colors of early evening. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the scent of worn leather and horse sweat mixed with the clean smell of open land, and the steady rhythm of hooves filled the valley with a presence that could not be ignored, not by the town, not by the ranch, not by the man who had waited so many years without complaint. The line of riders spread wide now, forming a broad arc across the pasture as they approached, their movement calm and measured, not hurried, not aggressive, but guided by purpose, the kind of purpose that came from memory and loyalty rather than anger or pride. Dust drifted slowly around them, settling back to the earth in soft clouds that glowed gold beneath the lowering sun, and in that gentle light the figures began to reveal themselves more clearly. Men and women seated tall in their saddles, their clothing marked by travel and time, their faces serious but not harsh, their eyes fixed on the solitary figure standing at the open gate. Elias did not move. He felt the feather resting in his pocket and kept his hand there, fingers curled lightly around it, drawing quiet strength from the simple object that had once been placed in his palm by a small hand trembling with fear, yet filled with trust. Years had passed since that moment. Years of drought and cold winters, years of working soil that gave little and demanded much. Yet the memory had never faded, and now, as the riders closed the final distance, he sensed that memory stepping out of the past and into the present at last. The leading horse slowed to a gentle walk about 50 yards from the gate, its head held high, ears forward, responding to the soft guidance of the rider seated upon its back, and the rest of the line followed in quiet unity, their motions slowing together until the thunder of hooves softened into a steady hush that spread across the field like the final note of a long song. Silence settled over the land, deep and wide, broken only by the faint creak of saddle leather and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the valley. Elias lifted his chin slightly and met the gaze of the figure at the front, a woman seated straight in her saddle, her dark hair tied neatly at the back of her neck, her expression calm and composed, her presence steady as the horizon behind her. She guided her horse forward a few more steps until she stood just beyond the wooden gate, close enough for the fading light to touch her face. And in that moment recognition passed between them, without a single word spoken, the quiet understanding that grows from shared history rather than explanation. Behind her, the long line of riders waited in respectful stillness, their horses standing patient and disciplined, their attention fixed not on the land or the house or the worn sign hanging from the gate, but on the man who had remained where he belonged when others turned away. Elias slowly removed his hand from his pocket and let it rest at his side, his posture tall, his breathing steady, his eyes clear, and as the evening sun dipped lower toward the western hills, casting a soft amber glow across the pasture, the woman at the front inclined her head slightly, a gesture simple yet filled with meaning, the kind of gesture offered to someone whose quiet actions had traveled farther than words ever could, and the land itself seemed to grow still, as if waiting for the next moment to speak. The evening air grew cooler as the sun slipped lower behind the western ridge, painting the sky in long streaks of amber and violet, and the entire line of riders remained still in the pasture, their horses standing quiet and composed as if they understood the weight of the moment unfolding before them. Elias Whitaker held his ground at the gate, his boots planted firmly in the same soil he had worked for decades, his shoulders steady, his breathing slow, the calm strength of a man who had weathered hardship. Without bitterness, the woman at the front guided her horse one step closer, the animal moving with careful grace until it stopped just a few yards from the wooden gate, close enough for the fading sunlight to reveal the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the quiet wisdom carried in her expression, and the familiar curve of her smile that had once belonged to a frightened child standing on this very land many springs ago. For a long moment neither of them spoke, because some truths did not need words, and silence often carried more respect than any speech ever could. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, brushing across the field in soft waves that whispered against the fence posts and the weathered boards of the house. And somewhere in the distance a meadowlark called out, its clear note floating across the open prairie like a blessing carried on the evening breeze. Elias felt the memory settle deep within him, steady and certain, the memory of a stormy night years before when a small figure had appeared at his door, soaked from cold rain, clutching a simple feather with trembling fingers, her voice quiet yet determined as she asked for shelter without fear or shame. He had opened the door without hesitation then, offering warmth, food, and a safe place to rest, not because he expected gratitude, not because he sought reward, but because kindness had always been the law he followed, even when the world around him chose suspicion instead. Now that same child stood before him as a grown woman, her posture straight, her presence calm, her eyes holding the same quiet strength that had once shone through tears beneath the dim glow of a lantern. She slowly lifted one hand from the reins and placed it gently over her heart, a gesture simple and sincere, and the movement passed like a signal through the long line of riders behind her. One by one, in perfect unison, the men and women seated upon their horses mirrored the gesture, hands rising to rest over their chests, heads bowing slightly in solemn respect, until the entire field became still beneath the fading light, a silent tribute offered not to power or wealth, but to a single act of compassion that had never been forgotten. The sight settled over the valley with quiet authority, stronger than any shouted command, deeper than any written law, and Elias felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the setting sun. He did not smile widely, did not raise his voice, did not step forward in triumph. Instead, he simply inclined his head in return, a small movement filled with dignity, acknowledging their presence without pride, receiving their respect without demand. Behind him, the old sign hanging from the gate swayed once more in the gentle breeze, its harsh message now seeming smaller against the vast horizon, its judgment fading in the face of something far greater than words carved into wood. The light continued to soften across the land as evening settled in, and the long shadows stretching across the pasture slowly merged into one unbroken line, binding rider and rancher, past and present, into a single quiet moment that spoke louder than any voice ever could. The last light of day settled gently across the valley, soft as a blanket laid over tired shoulders, and the long line of riders remained motionless in the fading glow, their hands still resting over their hearts, their heads bowed in quiet respect, while Elias Whitaker stood at the open gate with the same steady calm that had carried him through seasons of drought, loss, and lonely winters. The wind moved slowly now, no longer sharp, no longer restless, but warm and steady, brushing across the tall prairie grass until it bent in a single direction, as if the land itself had chosen to stand with him. The woman at the front lifted her head first, her eyes meeting his again with the quiet certainty of someone who had traveled many miles not for revenge, not for pride, but for remembrance. She lowered her hand from her chest and guided her horse forward one final step until the animal stood directly before the wooden gate, its breath rising in small white clouds against the cooling evening air. Elias watched her carefully, not with suspicion, not with surprise, but with the calm patience of a man who understood that the truth often arrived slowly, carried on the backs of those who never forgot kindness. She reached into the small leather pouch tied at her saddle and removed a folded piece of parchment, worn at the edges from long travel, its surface marked by careful handwriting that carried the weight of years. Without a word, she extended her arm and offered it toward him across the gate, her movement steady and respectful, the gesture simple, yet filled with meaning deeper than any speech. Elias stepped forward at last, closing the short distance between them, his boots pressing softly into the earth that had witnessed every hardship he had endured, and he accepted the parchment with both hands, holding it gently, as if it were something fragile, something sacred. The paper felt warm from the sun and from the long journey it had taken, and as he slowly unfolded it beneath the dimming light, his eyes moved across the careful lines written there, reading each word in silence while the entire field remained still, every rider waiting with patient dignity for the moment to pass. The document carried the official seal of the territorial office, pressed firmly into the lower corner, its mark clear and unmistakable, and the message written above it spoke in calm, measured language, confirming what had long been denied, what had been overlooked, what had nearly been lost. The land beneath his feet, the same land others had declared worthless, had been recognized at last as protected ground, preserved by law for the people who had once walked it before fences and borders were drawn across the plains. And his quiet act of sheltering a frightened child all those years ago had preserved not only her life, but the future of this soil itself. Elias finished reading and lowered the parchment slowly, his hands steady, his face calm, yet his eyes carrying the deep reflection of a man who had just witnessed the turning of history in the most unexpected way. He looked back at the woman before him, seeing not the frightened child from the stormy night long ago, but a leader who had carried memory across generations, who had returned not with anger, but with gratitude strong enough to move hundreds across open land. She gave a small nod, gentle and certain, and behind her the long line of riders straightened in their saddles, their presence quiet yet powerful, standing as living proof that kindness, once given freely, never disappeared into the past. The evening sky deepened into shades of purple and blue as the first stars appeared above the horizon, and the old wooden sign hanging from the gate creaked softly in the breeze, its harsh words now meaningless against the truth resting in Elias's hands. He did not tear it down. He did not speak against those who had placed it there. Instead, he simply folded the parchment carefully and held it close to his chest, standing tall beneath the wide American sky, while the land around him grew quiet, settled, and finally at peace. The night settled slowly across the valley, quiet and deep, wrapping the land in a cool stillness that followed the long heat of the day, and the first stars began to scatter across the wide Oklahoma sky, like small lanterns hung far beyond reach, steady and patient above the open prairie. Elias Whitaker remained standing at the gate with the folded parchment resting against his chest, his hands calm, his shoulders strong, his gaze moving slowly across the line of riders who had traveled so many miles to stand before him in silent respect. The horses shifted gently beneath their saddles, breathing soft clouds into the cooling air, their movements relaxed now, no longer driven by urgency, but guided by quiet purpose fulfilled. The woman at the front studied him for a long moment, her expression steady, her posture dignified, and in her eyes lived the memory of that distant stormy night when she had once stood on this same ground, small and frightened, carrying nothing but hope and a single feather clutched in trembling fingers. Elias lowered his gaze briefly to the parchment again, feeling the weight of its meaning settle deep within him, not as pride, not as victory, but as confirmation that patience and kindness had roots stronger than doubt. He carefully slipped the document into the inside pocket of his coat, placing it close to his heart, then lifted his head once more to meet the eyes of the riders gathered before him. The wind drifted gently through the pasture, brushing across the tall grass in slow waves that whispered against the wooden fence posts and the worn boards of the house, carrying with it the scent of earth cooling after a long day beneath the sun. Without hurry, the woman turned slightly in her saddle and raised her hand once again, this time with a simple motion that carried quiet instruction, and the long line of riders responded at once, guiding their horses into a slow, graceful turn across the field. One by one, they began to move away from the gate, their hooves pressing softly into the soil, leaving behind only faint tracks in the dust that would soon fade beneath the night wind. No cheers were spoken. No celebration filled the air. Only the steady rhythm of departing hooves carried across the valley, gentle and respectful, like the closing notes of a long and meaningful song. Elias watched them go without calling out, without stepping forward, his figure still and composed beneath the darkening sky, understanding that true gratitude did not need applause and true justice did not demand recognition. The last rider passed beyond the low ridge at the edge of his land, the final silhouette fading into the deep blue horizon, and silence returned to the prairie once more, wide and peaceful as it had always been. The old sign hanging from the gate swayed lightly in the breeze, its rough letters barely visible now in the dim light. And after a long pause, Elias stepped forward, reached out with one steady hand, and lifted the sign carefully from its nail. He did not break it. He did not throw it aside. Instead, he carried it slowly to the porch and leaned it gently against the wall beside the door, setting it down with quiet care, as if even harsh words deserved to be laid to rest without anger. Then he returned to the gate and stood for a moment, looking out across the open land stretching mile after mile beneath the starlit sky, the same land that had tested him, shaped him, and now finally stood protected for generations yet to come. He slipped his hand into his pocket and felt the familiar feather resting there, light as ever, unchanged by time, and a faint, peaceful breath escaped his lips as he closed his eyes for a single second, listening to the soft whisper of wind moving through the grass. Out here, under the endless sky, justice had come without noise, without force, carried only by memory, patience, and the quiet strength of a man who chose kindness when the world offered him none.